So my name is Corey Neimer, Emily Lapworth from UNLV, and I serve together as the co-chairs of the Bulk Digitization Task Force. For those of you who were here last year, you may remember we were an interest group the year before and became a task force this year to look at a few different things. Our group was divided into three task-based subgroups, and I'll be reporting on the first of those, which focused on a review of the application profile in terms of its applicability to bulk digitization. And then Andrea Page will be covering the other two subgroups, and I'll let her introduce the topic of those. I don't have slides, so I've passed around a little handout summarizing what this first group was involved with over the course of the year. So the three main points that we tried to cover were just sort of a review of what the problem was, difficulty of applying the current application profile, which is largely item-based, to aggregate descriptions. We did a review of workflows that were used in the different institutions and how they're going about doing bulk digitization work. And then finally, we ended up with the review of the Dublin Core application profile. In doing the first portion of this review, we relied on, as the base of our discussion, the DPLA Archival Description Working Group's report. And there's a link in the handout to that if you haven't read it already. Some of the things that they'd pointed out that needed to be addressed in metadata standards for aggregate description were the need for recording relationships is part of relationships from a scanned aggregate to a larger collection, as well as the need for having accurate metadata. A lot of institutions, when we got to a discussion of how the workflows worked, there were a number of institutions that were sort of bulk applying metadata where it didn't exist in lower levels of description. So where archives describe things hierarchically and rely on inherited information to be understood implicitly by users, when you're moving that into item level descriptions, in some cases people were just taking that higher level description and bulk applying it to everything that was coming down below, so that you didn't end up with, in the case of subjects, for example, specific subject terms for an item. You'd end up with the same subjects for all the items that were part of that series. That particular issue, as well as the scanning workflow, when we got down to the revision section, we were just sort of, we faced that continued problem of missing data in the original finding aid, and the need to either relax the specifications or require institutions to go back and do a lot of retrospective work. In the end, we put together a quick recommendation, and that's the last page. One of the things looking at DACs, or describing archives requirements, versus Mountain West versus DPLA, and then also the Archival Description Working Group recommendations. One of the things we noticed right off was the lack of optional fields in the Mountain West guidelines. Recommended rather than just optional or required. And we looked at that as maybe a possibility for revision to allow more flexibility in these particular cases, to allow institutions to avoid bulk application of terms that might not be appropriate at a particular level. But in the end, this is just a recommendation. Our working group tried to identify issues and look at places where the application profile didn't really work for archives, and come up with maybe a starting point for discussions. Looking forward, we'd like to encourage Mountain West to put together a wider group, not just archives, but the full spectrum of metadata specialists to look at these issues as well as other issues that were identified. Some of those are listed in the last paragraph on the handout. But those were implementing standardized right statements, potentially adopting EDTF, full implementation of DC terms, closer alignment with DPLA, and the removal of local fields. But that's my portion of this report, and I'll hand it off to Andrea.
Right, so, like was said, I'm filling in a bit for Emily Lapworth. She chaired one of the two subgroups with me, and that I participated in, and I chaired the other. So anyway, we're going to be talking about the recommendations for digitization specifications as well as the MWDL partner digitization equipment list. So first off, we'll start with Emily's group. The group consisted of Emily Lapworth, who chaired the group. I was in it. Darcy Pumphrey and Gina Strack were also on the group with us. And the main task that we wanted to go through in that group was first to review BCR's CDP. That actually took a while to figure out even what it stood for, because their website is so outdated on it that you can't actually find it. But that was actually, what was it? Bibliographical Center for Research's Collaborative Digitization Program, Best Practices Guide. That is what is currently linked on the MWDL website for best practices. So we wanted to see how that was doing and measuring up to what we felt the current needs were. We also wanted to find and review other best practices documents that are currently available, and our main focus was on bulk digitization. Although, to be completely honest, any recommendations for digitization specifications are also widely applicable to non-bulk projects as well. So it's handy. That didn't work the way I wanted. Hide. All right. So two of the big ones that we looked at, first of all, we looked at the BCR Best Practices Guide. It's a very approachable introductory document. It has a lot of good overview information, so it's a very good place to start in terms of getting familiar with the concepts, but it is 10 years old. And it shows that when it comes to recommendations about equipment to use, when it comes to some of the detail when you get further into it. So we wouldn't really recommend it as the primary resource that you're using to make your decisions about, everything that you're going to do with digitization going forward. So what we were looking at as kind of our main alternative were the FAGI guidelines, which are widely accepted, have been kind of the de facto standard for a lot of institutions already. It's something that is active. It's going to be updated further, I believe, as time goes on. It's not a dead document, and it's not associated with a dead association at this point, for better or worse. Anyway, so it's got some great information on it. It is a little bit more technical, though, so it is a more difficult document to dive into if you're newer to it, if you're in an institution where you've got people that are wearing a lot of hats and they're just trying to learn digitization as they're getting started. But it has very good format-based recommendations for file types and for resolution, for all of the details. And it breaks it down very well. So even if some of the deep diving is a little bit too much, it still has very, very good kind of item by item format recommendations that we feel are going to be very applicable to a lot of people. So what we created as a product was, we decided that since there's so much that can change in this field, so many other institutions that have worked on creating a lot of these documents to discuss the standards, that the best use of our time was actually to create an annotated bibliography, basically, of additional resources that are available, what their strengths are, what you might want to point to for one sort of project versus the other. So the main ones that we talk about at the beginning are BCR versus FAGI. But then we also go in to show some more detail in there. That's not really a very helpful for just looking at it URL. Are these slides going to be available?
Yes.
So, yeah, so probably the easiest way to go grab that. So we feel that by being able to have a document like this, it's going to be a lot easier to keep up to date. because if a standard changes, we can just point to the new standard. And it can meet a lot more of a wide array of needs, just because every institution is going to be a little bit different in what they're looking for. And it's something that can easily be shared widely with the MWDL community. The second group, we were compiling a list of digitization equipment at the different institutions, basically so that people can creep in on it and just decide whether or not somebody's got some equipment they're looking for, so they can actually talk to them and find out about the equipment, be able to do a little bit of easy legwork before risking spending thousands and thousands of dollars on equipment that may or may not do what they hope it's going to do. I chaired this group. Darcy Pumphrey, Darnell Melvin, Jamie Weeks, and Matt Brunswick were all on the team with me. And our task was to make a standardized template for recording the information so that it will be easily transferable, easily understandable from one institution to the next, fill out our own institution's tabs. We used a spreadsheet and had a separate tab for every single institution. And that way we had kind of a format for the other institutions to look at based off of how we decided to handle it. And then we kind of divide and conquer, contacted the other institutions to be able to fill out their sections. We had a grand total of 11 institutions who all participated so far, who have put in all or some of their holdings information. Everybody's varied a little bit in how much detail they decided to go into, but we've got a lot of really good information there. A lot of opportunities to be able to compare notes with some of our colleagues. So the list coverage includes still imaging equipment such as scanners and scanning rigs, standalone camera equipment. We did have an AV section, since that's a popular one now, and a lot more places are doing that in-house. And then also we had a section for any notable software helps for workflow, or just anything else that was that people felt might be worthwhile for other people to hear about that they may not have already heard about. Anyway, the next big question that we kind of want to put back to the group is how to go about sharing and ownership of these documents, because obviously it's nice to have collaboration through Google Docs, but if that's the only place where it goes and it's owned by somebody's work email account, that's probably not where we want it to permanently live. But
well, actually, Matt was running me through that Google sheet, and I thought that is a great resource, first of all, that you put together. Then people are trying to figure out, how do you get started with digitization? One of the things they want to know is, what is the institution that is in closest proximity to me that maybe has an equipment like a flash transfer machine, let's say, to digitize my 16mm film. So I was proposing if it would be okay to post that at the start with, on the MWDL site, under the resources page. And I don't know if you're at a place right now where it looks like it's ready to be hosted. So that would be my idea, and he thought that was pretty good, and he was going to actually talk to the group in the next meeting about it as well. So
okay, excellent.
Yeah, but just let me know if you think
you're
ready for that.
I think it should be. I know that there's even for myself, for my institution, there's still some extra details I want to put in because we have a lot of bits and pieces of things. But I think it's honestly at a point where it could be pulled. And it would be useful. Like most institutions have a decent amount of information, at least being able to point to what pieces of equipment they have. Like I said, the amount of detail that people go into on uses and things like that, it does vary, but I think it could be ready to get pulled out.
Well,
Yeah.
that would be really great.
Yeah. Any other questions for myself or Corey?
That's a photo op with Catherine over there. Thank you so much for the report.
Okay.
And we hope to add your resources to our page. So I'm looking forward to having you ready for your document.